March 1st marked the opening of a new chapter for POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And that new chapter is defined by the reappointment of Dariusz Stola as our director. This is an opportunity to reintroduce Dariusz to our North American Jewish friends, and American Friends of POLIN Museum is very eager to also introduce him to those who have not met him before. My name is Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, and I am the Ronald S. Lauder Chief Curator of the core exhibition and Senior Advisor to the Director, my favorite role. And so with that, I'd like to begin by asking Dariusz about his personal intellectual journey. And specifically, you are a distinguished historian of the 20th century in Poland, especially the period of communist Poland and the post-war years. You've dealt with March 68 anti-Zionist campaign. You've dealt with migration as a broader topic, but also much more specific to Poland. And my question to you is, what drew you to these topics, both intellectually and personally?
I've been asked this question many times, as if being a non-Jewish historian of Jewish history would be something strange. It's not. It started almost 40 years ago in the 1980s when I was a student at the Warsaw University back in communist Poland at that time, when by a coincidence of several factors, the Jewish past of Poland became more interesting to young people than it had been before. And I saw it in my generation. A few of the leading Holocaust scholars, for example, Polish Holocaust scholars, are of the same generation. Actually, they were my friends at the university, like Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett. So we know each other from non-research context. Actually, we were involved in an underground solidarity bulletin publishing in the 1980s at that time. But the key moment was in 1988, when I graduated Warsaw University. I joined the doctoral school at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and I was thinking about the topic for the dissertation research. And Professor Marcin Kula, my supervisor, told me to go to the archives and see the microfilms, which recently arrived from Israel on a basis of exchange of copies and documents between the Polish and Israeli archives. And that was the beginning of a renewal of relations between the two states, the relations that were broken in 1967 following the Six-Day War. Poland, like other communist countries, severed the diplomatic relations with Israel. Practically all kind of cooperation with Israel was non-existent in the 70s and 80s. So I went to the archive and I saw something, and I knew it's a treasure, because that was a personal archive of Ignacy Itzhok Schwarzbart, a Zionist from Krakow, who during the war was a Jewish representative to the Polish government in exile. So during the Holocaust, he represented Polish Jews to the Polish government in exile. He was the first person to read the reports coming from the Polish underground about the fate of Jews in German-occupied Poland. And he left a diary. Almost every day he was writing notes. So, immediately I saw it's a fantastic material. And I decided to write a book about Ignacy Schwarzbart and his reactions to the Holocaust, how he learned, what he did about it, and eventually his defeat. Because he lost his people, he lost the Polish Jews, the people he represented. He lost as a politician who remained loyal to the Polish government in exile, while many other people were reorienting to the new communist government in Poland. And in fact, he also lost as a Zionist because he never moved to Israel. Mm-hmm. He died in New York. So he was a Zionist who never moved to Israel. And that was the beginning. And then Professor Gutman once said that he got to a topic and then a topic got to him. And that was my case too. I realized how important, how fascinating a history it is. So I have researched on various topics related to the history of Polish Jews during the war. And then came democratic Poland soon afterwards. Situation changed. And in 1998, the government announced it was ready to give access to some files that were non-accessible under the communist regime. And as it was a few decades after the 1968 anti-Zionist campaign in Poland, I decided to, and I was the first person to see the communist secret police files on the topic. So, in effect, it was the sources leading me into topics. I saw them as important. I saw the questions, like the question of why the Communist Party turned against the Jews, against a tiny group of Jews that remained in Poland before 1968. And sometime later, I was invited to consult on the scenario for the POLIN Museum core exhibition in the making at that time. So that was the beginning of my contacts with this project.
But that led into a much deeper involvement. And I wondered if you want to say something about that transition and what convinced you that a museum of the history of Polish Jews was important and was something you would like to lead.
Well, first I must confess, I was skeptical. After several years of, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in the making, because it started in 1993, the idea popped up in 1993. So in the early 2000s, I became skeptical, saying, okay, to my friends, well, you will keep making this museum for the next 50 years and you will never see it ready. So when I saw the building growing, only then I changed my mind. I realized that, yes, it will happen. It's possible. In the meantime, I had some managerial positions. I was a vice president of a School of Social Sciences, which was important in my decision of going to the museum because I understood how much important are Excel spreadsheets. Very, I would say, not sublime aspects of representing the past, the managerial administrative aspects. So when this opportunity arises to join the team and in this key position of being the leader of it and the leader at the key moment right before the opening of the core exhibition, I didn't have any doubts. It was obvious for me that this is something that I probably had waited for.
So in many ways, it found you.
So,
Not
I got
unlike
to a
your
topic
other
and then the topic
projects.
got to me. And in the same way, I was invited to the museum, and then I realized how much I am committed to this institution.
So why does the history of Polish Jews matter today? Why does it matter?
Well, it matters a lot to different people for various reasons. It matters something else to Polish Jews, to non-Polish Jews, to non-Jewish Poles, to other Europeans. And I think this is the combination of these various layers of meaning that makes it so exceptional. So for non-Jewish Poles interested, it's an important chapter of the history of this country. And we repeat it again and again that you cannot understand Poland without the history of Polish Jews. For non-Polish Jews, Jews in Israel or Jews in America, wherever they have any Polish Jewish background or not, it's an important part of the Jewish history, of the history of diaspora. And the fact that through at least 200 years, the major part of world Jewry lived in the lands of Poland. This is something that you must know it to understand the history of diaspora. And then at the peak moment of the development of this community, when you have almost 3.5 million Jews in Poland, hundreds of newspapers, of political parties, of synagogues, of Jewish businesses, of Jewish scientists, journalists, artists, singers, comes the catastrophe. So the catastrophe comes from outside, but it happens in a country that had been deeply divided by the new anti-Semitic currents that took hold in the 20th century in Poland. So This is the combination of this incredibly rich history of the Jewish civilization in Poland, and then the catastrophe falling on a country. And that was the catastrophe to the Polish Jewry, first of all, to the world Jewry, to all the Jews. The loss of the Jewish culture in Poland was the loss to all the Jewish diaspora everywhere, and also to Poland. Only when you realize that in the history of small towns where half of the medical doctors, shoemakers, and tailors were Jewish, their cruel disappearance under the German occupation, how consequential it was. So, depending on to whom we speak and to whom we present this history, we must stress different aspects of this multi-dimensional past. Most of the visitors, most of the audience of the museum are non-Jewish Poles. So for them, it's a part of their history as history of Poland. But most of the biggest group of foreign visitors are Israelis and Americans. And I suppose many of the American visitors are Jewish Americans. So for many of them, it's a family history. And again, this history is rich enough to tell something to anyone, even to non-Jewish, non-Polish, other Europeans, for whom this is an important component of European history.
Absolutely. And I think that you mentioned the Holocaust, and I think for many American Jews, when they think of Poland and they think of Jews, the overwhelming, if you will, the overwhelming impression or the overwhelming memory is of the Holocaust. And so many of them, when they come to Poland, whether from Israel or North America, they feel this moral, almost religious obligation to honor those who died, and to visit the sites of the genocide. And so, what role do you think Polin Museum plays, or why should Polin Museum matter to North American Jews? Of course, as you said, it has a lot to do with the history of their own families. For some who, like my family, came before the war, even though they lost their relatives during the Holocaust, many of those who come are, in fact, either survivors or children or grandchildren of survivors for whom the Holocaust is a very central part of who they are. So, how would you express why Polin Museum and the history of Polish Jews that we present is or should be meaningful to them?
Well, first, the relation, I think this is a crucial aspect or crucial question for the understanding of the Polin Museum, is the relation between how it presents the Shoah history, the Holocaust history, and the rest of the Jewish history of Poland. Because Polin Museum, the building I'm in at present, makes part of a Holocaust memorial complex. The museum building stands in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Monument, the most known Holocaust monument in the world, probably. There is a number of other smaller monuments related to the Holocaust in our vicinity. So the museum makes part of a Holocaust memorial complex, but this is not a Holocaust museum, or more specifically, it's not only a Holocaust museum. The story we show is not reduced to the dramatic, horrible end of most of Polish Jews, but not all of them. So the Holocaust gallery is actually the biggest, the largest of the 9 galleries of the museum, but it's not the last one. There was life, there has been Jewish life in Poland after the war, quite fascinating. How the small rest of the Polish Jews, 10% of the pre-war number, re-established Jewish communal life and their private lives in post-war Poland. Then most of them emigrated, many of them to build the state of Israel. Literally, most of the leaders that were building the state of Israel in 1940s were of Polish Jewish origin, but some of them remained to the present, or their children or grandchildren. And also, let me add, a part of my interest in this Jewish history was that parallelly to the development of my interest in Jewish history was the miracle of the revival of Jewish life in Poland. These are parallel but somehow related phenomena. And I could see it. I could see people who were becoming Jews again, so to speak, rediscovering the Jewish part of their identities. And now it's a small but very vibrant community. And for me, a nice measure of being vibrant is how many quarrels you can have in any group of Polish Jews on any topic when three of them gather. It's a part of the great Polish Jewish tradition we should maintain, I suppose. So I think this is an important component of the museum. And to American Jews, well, in addition to what I already said, that Poland was the key part of the diaspora history for several generations, including at the moment of the great wave of Jewish migration from Europe to the United States. So almost all the American Jews are of Polish Jewish origin, probably 80%, maybe a little bit less, maybe more, but it means many of them. And what I realized that only a few of them know anything about it. And that's a shame. It's such a fantastic history. If it's so interesting for me, it can be interesting for others. Moreover, I saw many Americans coming to our museum, Jewish and non-Jewish. I was guiding our VIP guests through the core exhibition, and they were increasingly fascinated. It was not that their interest in Jewish history became satisfied with this visit. The opposite. They wanted to know more at the end of the exhibition. I think it shows the potential that people were discovering that there is much more than they knew about it. And this applies to most of the visitors, but I think for American visitors, because of this pre-existing misperception that Poland is just a big cemetery, the surprise was different, was bigger, because of these assumptions they had that there are no Jews, there are only ruins and the cemeteries. And there is much more than ruins and the cemeteries. Yes, there are many cemeteries, actually 1,200 we have in our catalog, and someone is to take care of them. We have a special program now in education to make local communities more committed to preservation of the Jewish cemeteries. Without them, we will never protect them. So there are many reasons, and I don't want to be reductionist, to reduce the interest in Polish Jewish history just to the origins of Americans visitors. Because I suppose you may develop interest in Polish Jewish history for a variety of personal reasons. The Jewish history of Poland was a fantastic laboratory of a variety of attempts how to deal with modernity, for example, how to respond to new challenges. We still can learn a lot, even, maybe especially in our turbulent times.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And the way I think about it also is that so much of the focus of Holocaust commemoration, understandably, is on those who died and the experience of those who survived and all of the circumstances and conditions around that. But I think for some visitors, some American Jewish visitors, when they come to the museum, they realize that the entire world, an entire world that they created was lost with them, and that these visitors had no idea of the depth, the richness, and the longevity of this world. As you indicated, for the interwar year period, the Jewish population of Poland was the largest, certainly in Europe. But during the 18th century, half the Jews in the world lived in Poland, 750,000 Jews. And when we say Poland, we're talking about, if you will, the historic territory, where we generally in the museum are thinking in terms of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which includes the territory of Poland today, but also surrounding countries. So that for some visitors, the feeling of loss is deepened by the awareness of how much was lost with those who perished. And so that in that way, it's another dimension, if you will, of Holocaust memory. But also, I think that, as you've said, there's an enormous resource here.
that this past was a fantastic laboratory, entrepreneurial in terms of inventing new ways of being Jewish.
Yes.
You can say, well, most of the community was very conservative, Hasidic or Orthodox, but, they were inventing new ways of being conservative. So even what we believe to be the most conservative parts of the Polish Jewish community before the war were actually reinvented in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there was a lot of thinking and trying, and sometimes, well, the ideas were not the best, that they failed the test of practice, but sometimes they were. And I think it's a fantastic message to anyone who's facing new circumstances, the world different from the world we have grown up into, and realizing that we have to invent new ways of being in this world. So there was a lot of trying, much of it very successful. If not this catastrophe, it would have been, even in communist Poland. I've just spent last year some time reading about Jewish life in Poland in the 1960s, really with a small community, but again, with a very vibrant life. By the way, very vibrant life sponsored by Joint Distribution Committee. That was the peculiarity of communist Poland. The only communist country that allowed for substantial foreign assistance of American Jews. So American Jews were present all the time since late 19th century in the letters coming from the immigrants, all kind of material assistance, donations to the communities.
I couldn't agree more. So let me ask you about POLIN Museum. It is, I think, widely recognized as one of the leading museums of its kind in the world. And I wanted to ask you what you think makes POLIN Museum distinctive among museums that present Jewish history.
Well, I remember the first months after our grand opening. We were exhausted because there was so much to do, but then I remember my surprise how much interest this new museum attracted. We had thousands of media clippings from all around Europe, including major newspapers, TV stations, websites, and so on. And I realized the story we are showing is interesting not only for Poles and Jews and Polish Jews and Americans of Jewish origin, but maybe interesting to a variety of people, to the French and German and Norwegian and Danish and Italian visitors who can read about it. We now belong to the European Association of Jewish Museums, so we can see what our colleagues do in other countries. We can talk about it. I think that an important difference lies in the fact that this museum was invented and designed to be not a community museum for the community members, but to be a museum for non-Jews. And most of the visitors are not Jewish, which means you have to explain to them very basic things that the Jewish visitor usually knows. Well, although I'm always surprised how little young Israelis know about the diaspora history. Now, as I am surprised how little Polish students know about history of Poland. That may be somehow related. But I think that was a strategic decision to think about the future visitor, the future audience, in terms of, I would say, a very limited knowledge of things Jewish. And it works, because you cannot overestimate ignorance. It's usually bigger than you expect. And I think that was the right decision. And then we saw people trying to imitate POLIN Museum. In the new Jewish museums in Europe, the most recent case is the beautiful Shtetl Museum in Lithuania, with the same architect and the same set of concepts that were used to make its exhibition, but also non-Jewish museums. I'm on the advisory council of the Museum of History of Poland, now in construction, not far from here, a huge museum. It's so clear that its exhibition was developed after we developed our exhibition. That means they have learned from us, which is good. It's okay, but it's certain satisfaction to see that others follow your ideas. Second feature of POLIN Museum, which is important, is that it operated before it was constructed. When the museum existed only as an institution, didn't have a building, didn't have the exhibition, it had educational program, it had cultural program. I know public institutions that exist but do nothing. This institution did not exist yet, but did a lot.
Right.
And it shows that there are synergies between what is the core business of any museum, which are exhibitions and collection, and other forms of cultural activity, concerts, dramas, lectures, book discussions, classes for kids. There is a synergy, and the value added is much bigger when you combine these different layers of activity. We see it every day. Actually, only half of the people who come to the museum building go into the core exhibition. The other half of the number of annual visitors come for a concert, for a temporary exhibition, for a lecture on a topic. This way we can maintain interest in Warsaw. A dozen years after the grand opening, we can maintain interest because every week there is something new and people know it.
As you know, and of course it was under your watch that we won the 2016 European Museum of the Year Award, which was the first time any museum in Poland had won that very, very prestigious award.
And it took me by complete surprise. And again, it reconfirmed that this museum attracts both, the elite public of museum experts and the masses of very ordinary people who want to learn something more.
When I think about POLIN Museum, I like to say, although not everybody agrees, I like to say it is not a Jewish museum. It is an institution of public history. And although, as you said earlier, it's part of a memorial complex, it's also not a memorial museum. It's a public history museum, and as such, it has an enormous responsibility to tell the truth and to have the kind of independence that will allow it to address difficult topics. And in so many countries, certainly in Eastern Europe, under communism, after communism, what has been required to have the relative independence to do so is something that we've also struggled with. And I wondered if you would comment on where you think POLIN Museum sits in regard to being able to fully and without constraint address the truths of history and difficult topics that are like the third rail in terms of the sensitivity of the Polish public.
So before I address this question, let me respectfully disagree. I believe that you may have a Jewish and universal museum at the same time, that there is no contradiction. Actually, there is no universal museum per se. There is no abstract point of view on any history. And I believe this perspective is as good as many others. And comparing to museums that we believe to be very universalistic, the great museums of Western Europe, like Louvre or British museums, these were imperial museums. When you have a history of a minority in a country that had been occupied for several generations by neighboring powers, and this is a different point of view on any history. This intellectual foundation, this many years of thinking and discussion that you have mentioned, this is the strong basis, which we can refer to when we are discussing how we should react to some current events. And then because in Poland, the past is important. And we have showed again and again that we are ready to talk about the most difficult topics. Actually, let me stress that the biggest national debate on history in Poland ever was the debate on the Polish participation in killing of the Jews in 1941 in the small town of Jedwabne in eastern Poland. So it was not only the biggest Polish debate on the Holocaust, it was the biggest Polish debate on the history ever. And that tells you something, how important this topic was. Sometimes it is challenging, like at present. We have a rise of anti-Semitism, both left-wing and the right-wing. There are challenges to it. But we are well prepared, intellectually well prepared, also legally, because the museum is a public-private partnership. We have 3 founders of the museum, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, the group that came with the initiative. The association convinced the city of Warsaw, Mayor Lech Kaczyński, who was the mayor of Warsaw at the time, and eventually the national government of Poland. And we have now these 3 bodies, which is also important for ongoing funding, the annual budget of the museum, which comes from various sources, which means it's diversified. When you operate in a risk environment, diversification is the answer. So both the legal construction of the museum, the fact that we have various friends and donors helped us operate sometimes at difficult moments. And finally, who comes to work at this museum? What kind of people want to work here? This is the most committed staff I have ever seen in any institution. Most of them are young, and they are not coming to make a lot of money. Well, you will not make a lot of money in museums in Poland, but what you find is meaning. You do something meaningful, and they know it. So we may have very vivid debates on a variety of topics, but that's because people treat their work seriously. This is not just a place to make money and pay your rent. It's a place to make something meaningful.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important activities at the museum, and an activity that has enormous impact, of course, are the educational activities. So if I were to ask you, what do you think of as the main goals of Polin Museum's educational program? And is there a way to measure the impact of these programs?
Well, measuring the impact of education is intrinsically difficult because, yes, you educate some young people, they grow, but this is not the only factor that shapes the understanding of the past or whatever you teach. So you never know how effective you were. Yes, there are some measures, short-term, long-term. And by short-term measures, for example, we ask all the participants in our educational activities, have you learned something new? 85% say, yes, I have learned something new. We ask how satisfied you are. Wasn't it too difficult? Was the language adequate? And, very, I would say, simple questions, but which are important. And we not only have Polish students or participants in the program. Now, because of the war in Near East, we don't have many Israeli groups, but we have had systematically for years developed a program for young Israelis coming. That was very important for us, that they don't see Poland only as a big cemetery, that they visit not only Auschwitz and Treblinka, but they also learn the history of the people they want to honor. And when we said that a museum makes part of a memorial complex, but it's not a memorial institution, I believe that in a way, yes. I think you said it, that the monument which stands in front of the museum honors the Jews of Warsaw Ghetto by showing how they died. This museum honors them by showing how they had lived, them and their parents, grandparents, and great-great-grandparents back to the Middle Ages. I think it's also a way of honoring them. This is so it is a memorial function, but different from other memorials. And I know them because I am the chairperson of the International Auschwitz Council. We debated every year what are the proper forms and ways of commemorating exactly in the memorial institutions of the Shoah, which are mostly located in Poland. So I think this is the skill which we have developed of speaking various languages. The most important statement I hear from our students and visitors is I want to learn more.
Exactly. 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 So I have another two questions for you, and then we'll wrap it up. The first is about the next chapter. You return to the museum at a critical moment. What challenges do you see? What excites you most about this coming, if you will, the next 5 years? What are some of your priorities? But in other words, looking forward.
So first, it's my third week at the museum.
And
I'm
or we
very
are
glad.
happy that you're here.
I'm very glad to see that Zygmunt Stępiński, who has led the museum when I was absent, has done a great job. This is a stable institution with a fantastic staff, with good procedures, good rules, with a fantastic organizational culture. Let me just tell you that I have learned from other museum directors that they are very willing to hire people who have Polin Museum in their CVs because they believe
Oh,
with those people, this culture will come. It's very nice to hear. Speaking about the future, well, there are certain plans that have been developed by Zygmunt and the whole team before I arrived. And the biggest one is the large educational program funded by the Norwegian government. For the next 5 years, it's mostly about education. It's to a large extent about the young people, in particular, reaching out to young people with new methods, new channels of communication, new language. This is really a challenge. I think Hannah Arendt once said that every generation is new generation. It's like immigrants. Well, they were born into a country, but they are different people. They don't have experience that I had or my children had. They are younger. So uh, this is always a challenge. And they have their own questions. And these questions
mm.
are different than the questions of the young people 20 years ago or 12 years ago when we were opening the core exhibition. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity. I'm very grateful to the Kingdom of Norway because this is not the first Norwegian grant. Our Norwegian partners are very happy with what the museum has done so far. This is why they offered this substantial grant for the education in the future. So we are going to develop educational programs very much. But even the core exhibition, in Polish, it's a wystawa stała. We call it permanent exhibition. But I always stress that you cannot have anything permanent which is based on solid scholarship. The intellectual foundation of our exhibition is academic scholarship, and academic scholarship is developing too. There are new discoveries, new perspectives, and new questions asked. So we will have to follow it. There is a number of challenges which are completely external to us, like the war in the Middle East and the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of left-wing anti-Zionism. And because I happened to write a book about the communist anti-Zionism in Poland in the 1960s, I have kind of a déjà vu again and again. But this is a real problem, which we didn't have in Poland a few years ago. I would say, thanks to the communist regime and the very vulgar anti-Zionism of the Communist Party in Poland, it was a kind of vaccine to us. In my generation, no thoughtful person would have used the language we remembered from communist Poland. But now there is a younger generation, and for them, the meaning is different.
And one thing you had said to me in an earlier conversation is that one of the, if you will, weapons or one of the strengths of Polin Museum in fighting anti-Semitism is history, is the history of Polish Jews. Do you want to reflect on that?
Yes, well, especially in Poland, when a lot of claims of anti-Semites are history-based. This is just distorted history. This is untrue, and we can prove it. We can show it. And I believe that the museum's contribution to the struggle against anti-Semitism after our grand opening was that we had the strategic initiative. We decided the topics to be discussed,
Right,
not them.
right.
Recently, because of this intensification of anti-Jewish propaganda, and some of it is it's so obvious to me.
As you know, Polin Museum was created through an extraordinary partnership between public institutions and private philanthropy, including many supporters in the United States. Um, I'm interested in your thoughts on the role of philanthropy in sustaining Polin Museum as an institution dedicated to memory, scholarship, dialogue, to many of the challenges that you have just mentioned.
Now, actually, this morning, I was writing a letter to the new American ambassador to Warsaw. I met him yesterday at a concert. And I was very happy to learn that he already visited the museum. I was a big fan of the museum. I was sending him the membership card so he can visit. He will have a discount ticket next time he comes. Uh, so in writing this letter, I stressed how important were the donors and the friends of this museum in the United States. On the wall of our main lobby, right when you enter the main lobby, you see the names of our founding members, the key members. And they not only gave substantial amount of money, which made the production of the core exhibition possible, and the educational program and the cultural program, which I mentioned, existed even before the grand opening. For them, clearly, it was more than giving money. The personal commitment of them was so important. Also for the morale of me and other people who work here, that there is a transcontinental community of people for whom the history of Polish Jews is important. It's so important not to feel alone, especially in dark times. Of course, money was important too. When I said that the Polin Museum is a public-private partnership, let me add that the partners very wisely divided labor in the making of the museum. Polish government and the city of Warsaw paid for this beautiful building, which I love. I love the building and I love Rainer Malamaki, the Finnish architect who designed it.
Agreed.
The core exhibition was designed and then produced by the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute on the basis of this very effective fundraising, mostly among Polish Jews in the United States of America, which gave the association a foundational independence from the nice Polish politicians. Well, they were nice, they funded the building. I understand that politicians sometimes want to help you, and they were really helpful, but they could not interfere in the design of the core exhibition. So yes, there was open debate in the Museum Council, where all the parties are represented, but the fact that the association could rely on American donors was very important.
Yes, and in fact, this goes to our conversation about independence, that the association as the private partner and American donors as an independent stream of funding actually is critical to the relative independence of the museum, that the museum is not solely dependent on the city and the ministry for funding, and the ministry and the city cannot by themselves dictate who will be the director. And there are many things that the museum might like to do where there might be an objection from one of the public partners, but we can do what we want to do anyway because the association and our philanthropists, our benefactors, are supporting what we want to do. So I think that the philanthropy is not only important just in the very simple terms of providing resources, but our distinguished benefactors are also stewards. They also have a vision for the museum and are very supportive of what we're trying to do, and also provide the funds that make it possible for us to be much more and relatively independent. So with that, I want to thank you very, very much, Dariusz. It's always such an extraordinary pleasure, really, to talk with you. I've missed it, during the
Thank you,
last few
Barbara. You're
years.
very kind.
But I want to tell all those who are listening, and especially American Friends of POLIN Museum, that you will be visiting the United States, and we hope that many of those who are listening today will have the opportunity to meet you in person. So I would ask all of those who are here today to follow announcements from American Friends of POLIN Museum for upcoming events, and we will be sending out invitations. So thank you again, Dariusz. It
Thank you
really
very
has
much.
been such a pleasure, and we are so, so fortunate to have you as our director. I cannot express this really personally, but I know on behalf of everyone how much we do appreciate that. And so with
Thank you very
that, I
much.
thank you and look forward to seeing you here.